A man is falling out of the sky. His cockpit has just exploded, his leg is shredded by metal, and the Pacific Ocean below him is boiling with sharks. He isn't thinking about glory. He isn't thinking about medals. He's thinking, this is how I die. And yet, this moment, this single breath between life and oblivion, will ignite a chain of events that rewrites the fate of an entire war. Because from the ashes of one pilot's fall, another will rise, an unknown farmer from South Dakota, who will step into the same sky and change everything the world thought it knew about air combat. If you're watching this right now, stay with me. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you first heard this story, because what you're about to witness is history at its most human and its most terrifying. 20,000 feet over Guadalcanal, the sky didn't feel like sky at all. It felt like a throat-tight, merciless closing around anyone foolish enough to fly through it. On October 9, 1942, Marine pilot Marion Carl learned that truth, as a zero, slipped behind him with the ease of a predator, settling its jaw around a stunned animal. His Wildcat, that stubborn metal brute, groaned under every roll he forced upon it. The zero light, as a rumor, followed without effort. The Pacific sun flashed across its wings like a blade. A breath later, explosions stitched across Carl's canopy, shattering glass and tearing into his leg. His instruments died. His Wildcat became a falling coffin. He bailed out into air that tasted like burning metal. And below him waited an ocean so thick with fins that pilots said the water itself had teeth. By every rule of this place, Carl should have disappeared. Yet he lived, hauled from the edge by luck or fate, or something darker that stalked this island. But survival wasn't victory. Not here. Guadalcanal was a grinder, a place where pilots didn't serve, they endured. The American press called them the Cactus Air Force, as if a nickname could soften the truth. The pilots themselves had another word, the graveyard. They slept in malaria-soaked tents, walked past wrecks with dried blood still on the metal, and climbed into planes that rattled like they had already decided the outcome. The problem wasn't the zero alone. The Japanese pilots were veterans carved from years of combat in China and Pearl Harbor. They baited the Americans, dragged them into turns they couldn't win, and finished them with cold, predictable precision. The American doctrine dive-shoot-run looked clean on paper. In the swirling chaos above Guadalcanal, it was just another way to die. Yet even in a sky ruled by ghosts, something unexpected was coming. Not a new aircraft, not a new miracle strategy from Washington, but a farm boy, a man. Nobody asked for a pilot. The Navy didn't even want someone whose greatest skill came from chasing jackrabbits across frozen plains. In a war full of machines and doctrines, sometimes the difference is a single human being. And his name was Joe Foss. Long before Joe Foss ever smelled aviation fuel or felt the vibration of a Wildcat engine beneath him, his world was a stretch of wind-burned earth in South Dakota, where winters punished the land, and boys learned early that survival wasn't a lesson, it was a habit. He was born in 1915 on a farm so isolated that the nights felt like they belonged to another century. No electricity, no steady income. No safety nets, just weather livestock and work that started before sunrise and ended long after a boy's bones should have been allowed to rest. The Great Depression didn't hit his family like a crisis. It hit like a siege. Crops failed, money vanished, neighbors lost their land. And Joe, barely 12, found himself stepping into the kind of role most men didn't grow into until their 30s. Food didn't come from stores. It came from what you could catch. That's where his father taught him the rule that would shape not only Joe's childhood, but the battlefield he would one day command: don't waste shells. Jackrabbits didn't run straight. They juked, zigzagged, darted through brush like ghosts. To hit one, Joe had to aim, not at the animal, but at the future, the place where speed, wind instinct, and movement all converged. While other kids memorized arithmetic tables, Joe's mind was quietly learning ballistics. Lead distance, angle, momentum, deflection. Micro-calculations no chalkboard could teach. This wasn't target shooting. It was prediction performed in fractions of a heartbeat. It was the birth of the skill that no military academy on Earth could replicate. And life on the farm sharpened more than his aim. It forged that untranslatable Finnish word the family used, sisu, a kind of grit that doesn't shout, doesn't break, and doesn't back away when fate picks a fight. Joe hauled water through blizzards, worked frozen soil with bare hands, and learned to watch the sky the way a hunter watches brush for the first twitch of movement. But even as he trudged through fields with a shotgun too big for his shoulders, something in him ached upward to the clouds, to the roar of engines he had only seen in magazines. He didn't just want to escape the farm. He wanted to fly above it, to trade the weight of the earth for the freedom of sky. And soon, the sky would answer him, even if the world tried to say no. By the time Joe Foss reached his mid-20s, the dream that had started on that frozen farm was burning so hot inside him, it felt like it might crack his ribs. Flying wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was oxygen. In 1933, when his father took him to an air show, and Joe saw a Marine squadron carving loops in the sky, something irreversible happened. Those biplanes didn't just fly. They sang. And Joe, standing in work boots, still caked with soil, whispered to himself, "That's what I'm going to do." Life didn't care. Life had other plans. When a downed power line killed his father, Joe was 19. College flying ambition, everything froze. Someone had to keep the family alive. That someone was him. So he put his dream in his pocket and ran the farm, working days until his muscles trembled, and studying nights until his vision blurred. It took him 6 long years just to earn enough credits for college. But he did it. Sisu, again, quiet, stubborn, unshakable. He washed dishes to pay for flight school. He begged, borrowed, clawed his way to every hour in the air he could get. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Joe didn't hesitate. He rushed to enlist in the Navy as a fighter pilot. The answer hit harder than any enemy shell he would ever face: rejected. "You're too old, 26. 1 year past the cutoff. 1 year past the line drawn by men in offices who had never chased a jackrabbit across an open field or watched their father die in their arms. They offered him a consolation prize: teach other boys to fly. Stay safe. Stay home." To Joe Foss, it wasn't just a rejection. It was an insult. It was someone else telling him the story of his life when he'd spent every sunrise earning the right to write it himself. So he broke the rules. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve, slipping through the cracks of bureaucracy like a man squeezing through the bars of a cage. He became an instructor, but he refused to stay one. He wrote letters. He argued with officers. He nagged, pushed, annoyed, demanded. He once joked he was the loudest man in the U.S. Navy, and he meant it. Eventually, someone gave in more to shut him up than reward him. Joe was sent to advanced fighter training, and soon after assigned to VMF 121, a squadron bound for the Pacific. As Marion Carl was falling from the sky, Joe Foss was boarding a transport ship, heading straight into the deadliest airspace on Earth. He wasn't supposed to be there. And yet, he was exactly what Guadalcanal didn't know it needed. Henderson Field didn't look like a military base, so much as a scar the jungle refused to heal. When Joe Foss stepped off the transport plane in October 1942, the heat slammed into him first, a heavy, rotten breath rising from mud fuel and bodies that had been buried too quickly or not at all. The air tasted metallic, sour, alive in the wrong way. Men didn't walk here. They slogged every footstep, sinking into soil soaked with rain oil and blood that no one bothered scrubbing off anymore. This was the home of the Cactus Air Force, a nickname that tried and failed to hide how desperate things really were. Wrecks lined the runway like headstones. Wildcats with wings sheared off P-39s, nose first in the mud, burned out hulks that still smelled of cordite. Mechanics crawled over broken fuselages like ants trying to resurrect machines that had died 3 pilots ago. The pilots themselves looked worse. Their faces were tinted yellow from atabrine, the anti-malaria drug that made them sick even as it kept them alive. Their eyes were ringed with sleepless red circles, and their flight suits were permanently stained with sweat and grease. These weren't fresh recruits. These were survivors on borrowed time ghosts, still walking, because the war hadn't collected them yet. When the old man walked in, 27, sunburned, a little stiff from the farm heads barely lifted, they'd seen too many newcomers, new meat, new replacements, new names that would be carved into nothing by week's end. Then Joe saw his assigned aircraft, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The same model Marion Carl had nearly died in days earlier. Heavy, slow, underpowered. No match for the zero-in-turn fight's climb rates or energy retention. A plane known more for stubbornness than elegance. A plane pilots had nicknamed many things, but never anything kind. The executive officer, Duke, delivered the briefing like a funeral prayer. Never turn with a zero. Never. Dive, shoot, run. If you try anything else, you die. It wasn't arrogance. It was exhaustion distilled into doctrine. Something to cling to when you had no better ideas. Joe listened. He nodded. He respected the wisdom. But inside, something tugged at him. Something older than manuals. Older than aerodynamics. Something born on a field back home, where jackrabbits taught him that survival came from seeing the world, not as it was, but as it would be. Henderson Field was hell. But hell had rules. And Joe Foss had spent his entire life learning how to break rules just enough to survive. The next morning, he would climb into his Wildcat for the first time, and the graveyard would test whether a farmer had any business challenging death in the sky. Joe Foss's first mission over Guadalcanal wasn't a warm-up lap. It was a blade test. Either you cut or you get cut. When his Wildcat clawed its way up to 15,000 feet, the sky didn't feel open. It felt ambushed. The veterans had warned him, they come out of the sun. If you see them, it's already too late. And today, those words pressed on his spine like a hand. Then the radio snapped alive. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. Joe looked up and the sky broke open. A formation of zeros poured down like falling stars, slicing through sunlight with impossible speed. They weren't attacking. They were descending with the confidence of predators who've already chosen which animal in the herd will die first. The doctrine echoed in his head. Never turn with a zero. Dive and run. So he shoved the stick forward and dropped the Wildcat into a screaming, bone-rattling dive. The plane trembled so hard, it felt like the bolts would shear apart. Tracers stitched the air around him, green-white lashes of molten metal. Zeros stayed glued to his tail. Beautiful, terrifying machines, whose pilots flew with years of combat in their blood. Joe hit the canopy line of the jungle, and finally shook them off. But when he landed back at Henderson Field, he wasn't relieved. He was furious. Running wasn't winning. Running was a delay, a stall, a way to live 20 seconds longer. But he hadn't come here to survive. He had come here to hunt. His chance came 4 days later on October 13th, in a patrol that detonated into chaos the moment Zeros and bombers fell into their airspace. Planes crisscrossed in frantic spirals. Engines screamed. Pilots swore into radios that no longer mattered. Up here, the difference between a turn and a mistake was half a heartbeat. Joe spotted at a zero, sliding onto his wingman's tail, the Japanese pilot, tightening the arc, lining up the exact kill shot they had practiced over China, the Philippines, everywhere they'd bled the world. Doctrine said back off. Dive away. Find an easier target. But the farm boy's mind didn't run doctrine. It ran angles. He rolled hard. The Wildcat groaned, but obeyed. He wasn't aiming at the zero. He was aiming at the air where the zero would be the same way he had led jackrabbits, sprinting through frozen brush. He fired a 3-second burst of .50 caliber fire into empty sky. To anyone watching, it looked insane, wasteful, desperate. To the zero pilot locked in his perfect turn, it was a death sentence. He flew directly into the invisible wall of Joe's lead. The wing tore free. Fire erupted. The fighter disintegrated into a glittering trail of metal and smoke. Joe didn't outturn him. He didn't outrun him. He outthought him. When he landed, the ghosts at Henderson gathered around him. This farmer had just done something no manual taught. He'd made the Wildcat dangerous. "My plane's a truck," Joe told his crew chief, "but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." And for the first time, men who had survived only by running leaned forward and listened when he spoke. The pilots at Henderson had seen enough death to distrust anything that sounded like hope. But Joe Foss wasn't offering hope. He was offering methods, something solid they could feel in their bones the moment the tracers left their guns. He gathered the misfits, the new arrivals, the men who'd lost too many friends to believe in speeches, and he taught them the logic of the hunt. Not a new doctrine, not a bold strategy from Washington. A simple truth carved out of farm soil and cold wind: don't chase them, lead them. And the men listened because every other idea had already gotten someone killed. Their little band of wildcats had no proud nickname, no mascots. Nothing but exhaustion and a patchwork of battered planes that all rattled in their own ways. But when reporters on the island witnessed this ragged squadron following a farmer into battles they shouldn't survive, they finally gave the group a name: Foss's Flying Circus. It stuck. On October 16th, the circus met its first real test, a formation of 32 Japanese aircraft bombers, wrapped in a shell of Zero escorts, bearing down on the island like a hammer, falling toward an already cracked anvil. Foss had 8 fighters. Not 8 perfect machines, 8 patched-up wildcats whose pilots hadn't slept through the night in weeks. 32 versus 8. No sane man saw a fair fight. But Foss didn't plan to fight fair. He planned to fight smart. He ordered his men into the Thakweave, a maneuver newly invented by U.S. Navy pilot John Thak, but barely understood outside training manuals. Most squadrons treated it as a theory. Foss treated it as a lifeline. 2 planes crossing paths, covering each other's tails, making it impossible for a Zero to sit behind one without exposing itself to the other. It was a dance, dangerous, precise, and completely unnatural to pilots trained to think like lone hunters. But in that sky, it worked like destiny. Foss dove first. He didn't chase a Zero. He led it, drawing an invisible line through the air and firing into the future. The Zero erupted. Another dove on him immediately, but Foss's wingman rolled into the weave, catching the attacker in a clean firing line. One short burst. Another Zero fell apart in sunlight. Around them, their tiny squadron performed an impossible symphony, 8 battered wildcats carving through a formation 4 times their size, weaving, rolling, cutting in and out like a single animal with 16 wings. In the span of 10 furious minutes, Foss's circus shot down 5 Japanese planes. All 8 wildcats came home. When they landed, the graveyard felt different. It felt just for a moment alive. No one said it aloud, but the men knew the Zero wasn't a god. The Wildcat wasn't a coffin. And death in the sky was not inevitable. Not if you learned to think like a farmer who could hit a rabbit in full sprint with 1 shot. Foss didn't give them miracles. He gave them a fighting chance. Word travels fast on an island where death is always listening. Within days, the Flying Circus wasn't just a nickname. It was a rumor spreading through every muddy tent, every foxhole, every mess line at Henderson Field. Men spoke of it quietly, the way soldiers talk about something they're afraid to believe in. A squadron that came back whole. A wildcat that could outthink a Zero. A farmer who fired at empty sky and somehow hit the future. And while the island whispered, Joe Foss went to work dismantling a legend. From October 18th to October 25th, the Pacific sky became his hunting ground. Each day, the Japanese sent bombers and fighters. Each day, Foss climbed into a wildcat that rattled harder, leaked more oil, and bore new scars. And each day, he returned with another victory carved into the air behind him. 2 kills on the 18th, another on the 20th. By the 23rd, just 10 days after his first kill, Joe Foss was officially an ace. For most pilots, 5 victories was a lifetime achievement. For Foss, it felt like the opening verse of a longer, darker song. He didn't soar through battles. He ground his way through them, calculating lead, reading enemy angles, the way he once read rabbit tracks in winter dust. When fatigue blurred his vision, instinct filled the gaps. When Zeros tried to bait him into turns, he resisted with a stubbornness that felt carved from prairie stone. On October 25th, Foss found himself in another swirling maelstrom. Wildcats and Zeros tangled so tightly that sunlight vanished behind wings and smoke. In minutes, he downed 3 Zeros in a series of perfectly timed bursts that felt less like combat and more like execution. By the time he returned to Henderson, sweat-soaked and shaking, he wasn't the old man anymore. He was the pilot others watched when they climbed out of their tents at dawn. He was proof that the Zero could bleed, and that mattered more than any number on a scoreboard. But with every Zero that fell, something else rose pressure. The Japanese high command was listening too. They knew the name now, Foss. They heard it shouted across radios by pilots who didn't come back. They saw it in reports, dripping with disbelief, wildcat attacks that shouldn't work, evasive maneuvers that made no sense. Americans firing at empty sky only to have a Zero explode, a heartbeat later. The hunters of the Pacific suddenly felt hunted. At Henderson Field, the mood shifted. The ghosts looked a little less hollow. Mechanics worked faster. Pilots stood straighter. The belief that had been eaten alive by months of losses began to crawl its way out of the grave. But every miracle has a cost. And Foss's was coming fast. Because when you climb high, when you defy odds day after day, the sky starts paying attention. And the sky in the Pacific War always demands its due. The Japanese had lost enough planes to know one truth. If they wanted Guadalcanal back, they'd have to kill the farmer. And so, on November 7th, the hunters finally came for him. Foss led his patrol into a sky that looked deceptively calm, bright blue, wide open. But calm skies on Guadalcanal were liars. The ambush hit like a hammer out of nowhere. A swarm of veteran Zero pilots, hand-picked killers, dropped from the sun in a coordinated strike meant not to scatter the Americans but to erase them. The fight was instant chaos. Wildcats rolled dove, clawed for altitude. Zeros sliced through the formation with terrifying precision. Foss shot down one, then another. He lined up a third kill, the enemy fighter filling his gun sight, right as cannon fire slammed into him from behind. His cockpit filled with smoke. His engine ruptured in a violent blast that threw shrapnel across his legs and arms. The Wildcat bucked, shook, and died beneath him. He was falling, again. He bailed out at the last second, plunging into the dense jungle. The canopy swallowed him, whole branches tearing at his flight suit as he crashed through layers of green. When he hit the ground, he was bruised, bleeding, and somehow alive. Marines found him hours later, a shaken shadow of the man who'd taken off that morning. 2 days later, still bandaged and exhausted, Foss climbed back into another Wildcat, and the sky tried to kill him again. This time, he chased a Japanese float plane, the gunner swiveling in the back with a clear shot. Foss never saw it. The gunner opened fire. Metal ripped through his engine in a deafening roar. Fire burst across the cowling. The Wildcat seized, coughed, and died. He wasn't over the jungle now. He was over the ocean. The Pacific received him like a cold, dark mouth. The impact stunned him. The plane sank in under 30 seconds, dragging him into darkness before he kicked free and broke the surface, coughing salt water. And then he saw them. Fins. Dozens. Circling. The Zero had failed. The ocean would not. For 4 hours, 4 unthinkable hours, Joe Foss drifted in some of the most shark-infested waters on Earth. They bumped him, tasted him, circled tighter each time. He kicked, thrashed, cursed, prayed, but mostly he waited. Because that's what farmers do. They endure what should kill them. Just when the sun began melting into the horizon, a wooden canoe appeared, cutting across the waves like a miracle with oars. 2 native islanders sent by an Australian coast watcher, who had seen the crash by pure luck, beat the water with their paddles to keep the sharks at bay. They dragged him aboard. His skin was cold as stone. His lips were turning blue. By the time he returned to Henderson Field, Foss was barely conscious. He had malaria. He was severely dehydrated. His body was beginning to shut down. Doctors grounded him immediately. The Japanese high command celebrated. They believed the ghost of Guadalcanal was finally dead. But ghosts have a habit of returning. And this one wasn't done hunting. For 2 weeks, Joe Foss lay trembling in a hospital cot, sweat soaking the thin canvas beneath him, as malaria tore through his body like an invading army. He shook so violently at night that corpsmen had to hold him down to keep him from rolling off the bed. Fever dreams came in waves, sharks circling zeros, diving friends, calling out over the radio before falling silent forever. Guadalcanal had a way of following a man, even into unconsciousness. Outside, the flying circus flew without him. Inside, Foss burned. But beneath the fever, beneath the weakness that hollowed out his face and made his hands tremble like an old man's, something else lived. Something harder. The same Sisu that had pushed a farm boy through blizzards, through loss, through rejection, through every locked door standing between him and the cockpit. The jackrabbits were getting away, and Joe Foss had never let a target escape. So the moment he could stand barely, he walked out of the infirmary and straight back toward the flight line. A medic shouted after him. A doctor cursed. Foss didn't stop. He climbed into another battered Wildcat with sweat running down his spine and nausea coiling in his gut like a snake. On November 30th, the ghost returned to the sky. He shot down another zero, and the Japanese felt the shift instantly. Reports came in. The American farmer is back. The ghost returns. His squadron is hunting again. The more fiercely the fever raged, the sharper Foss seemed to fly. His body weakened, but his instincts sharpened. Men said he flew like he could feel the enemy before he saw them. Like the sky whispered trajectories to him. Like something between genius and madness lived inside him now. By January 1943, Foss's tally stood at 23 confirmed kills. 3 away from breaking the most sacred record in American aviation, Eddie Rickenbacker's 26 victories from World War I. That number was a mountain no pilot dared dream of climbing. An untouchable symbol of American air supremacy. A legend, not a goal. And here was a half-delirious 27-year-old farm kid flying a plane held together by tape oil and stubbornness crawling his way up that mountain 1 0 at a time. But every flight cost him. Mechanics had to lift him out of his cockpit. When he landed, his body shaking so violently from chills that he couldn't unbuckle his own harness. He vomited behind the tents between sorties. Sometimes he blacked out in the heat, waking only because someone slapped him back into the present. He was fighting 2 wars now, one in the sky, one in his bloodstream. And the terrifying part was this: he was winning both. But the final push, the one that would carve his name into history forever, was still ahead of him. And the sky was gathering its storm. January 15th, 1943. The day the sky tried its best to kill Joe Foss, and failed. He woke before dawn, drenched in fever sweat, shivering so hard the cot rattled beneath him. His vision swam. His pulse hammered like a loose rivet in his skull. Any sane doctor would have chained him to the bed. But insanity had become a survival trait on Guadalcanal, and Foss had long since embraced it. Word came in at sunrise: a massive Tokyo Express, a heavily escorted Japanese convoy, was moving toward the island. The enemy was throwing everything they had to break Henderson Field once and for all. Zeros, bombers, float planes, veteran pilots itching to erase the name haunting their kill reports for months. Foss didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission, didn't care about orders. He simply walked, shaking, pale, half-delirious, toward his Wildcat, strapped himself in, and took off into a sky boiling with black dots. What awaited him was the largest air battle he had ever seen. The sky was a furnace. Bombers lumbered below zeros, spiraled above, and Wildcats sliced through the chaos like desperate knives. Radios screamed useless warnings. Tracers lit the air like fiery handwriting. It was a battlefield so crowded that pilots swore they could smell burning oil even before aircraft began falling. Foss's fever blurred the horizon. His hands trembled on the stick. But instinct, honed from a lifetime of leading moving targets, cut through the sickness. A zero slipped behind one of his wingmen. Foss didn't think. He simply reacted. He rolled hard, not toward the zero, but toward the empty air, where his mind predicted the fighter would commit its turn. He fired a burst, nothing more than a ripping stroke of .50 caliber flame, and the zero flew straight into it. The plane shattered. Kill number 24. Another zero dove on a group of Wildcats. Foss shoved the throttle forward, his engine howling in protest. The Japanese pilot tried the classic zero-move drag, the American into a tightening turn. Foss refused the bait. Instead, he performed a high side pass, rolling over the top of the zero and dropping behind him from the blind spot. One burst. Engine explosion. A fireball spiraling toward the sea. Kill number 25. He had just tied the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker. But fate wasn't finished. Far ahead, a Japanese roof float plane was trying to escape the melee, an enemy that should have been beneath concern on this day of giants. But Foss saw opportunity, one more kill, one more step into history. The roof's pilot pulled into a desperate climbing escape turn. Foss didn't follow. He calculated. He saw the future the way he saw rabbit trails in drifting snow. He lifted his nose, fired a long, arcing burst that looked utterly insane, aimed not at a plane, but at a prediction. The bullets curved into destiny. The roof flew straight into the storm of lead. It disintegrated. The cockpit vaporized. The wreck tumbled into the Pacific. Kill number 26. History rewritten in a single breath. When Foss landed, still shaking violently from fever, the entire base was waiting. Mechanics, pilots, cooks, Marines, men who had lived too long in the shadow of death rushed the plane. They lifted him from the cockpit. His flight suit drenched his face the color of ash. They didn't see a farmer. They didn't see a man. They saw America's new ace of aces, a living legend pulled from the jaws of malaria, zeros, jungle sharks, and fate itself. For one night, Henderson Field wasn't a graveyard. It was a place where history stood on its feet and cheered. While Henderson Field roared with celebration hundreds of miles away in Rabaul, the mood inside Japanese briefing rooms turned to something cold and unfamiliar fear. For months, Zero pilots had flown with an almost arrogant certainty. They were faster, lighter, more maneuverable. Their doctrine was flawless. Their training was legendary. And the Wildcat, a clumsy American brute, they considered a chore, not a threat. But now, something impossible was happening. Veteran pilots were returning pale, trembling, unable to explain what they had seen. Their reports sounded like superstition. He fires into empty sky. He doesn't chase. He predicts. He's not turning with us. It's like he knows where we will go before we know it ourselves. A few whispered a name with a tone usually reserved for ghosts or curses. Foss. To Japanese intelligence officers, nothing made sense. Their doctrine told them exactly how Americans fought, how they panicked, how they broke formation, how they died. But Foss wasn't following the script. He was ignoring every rule the Japanese relied on. Every time he pulled the trigger, another zero evaporated in fire. The hunters of the Pacific had become the hunted. And the invisible weapon wasn't a new engine, a new wing design, or a new gun sight. It was the mind of a farm boy who learned to shoot rabbits that never ran straight. But the miracle had its price. In the days following his record-shattering victory, Joe Foss's body finally demanded payment. Malaria hit him again, harder than before. He collapsed in his tent, shaking violently as fever consumed him. His weight plummeted. His skin took on a sickly yellow hue. His strength evaporated until he could barely sit upright. Doctors grounded him permanently. This time, not even his stubbornness could fight the order. He left Guadalcanal, not as a triumphant warrior, but as a man carried on a stretcher, thin, hollow-eyed, broken, by the island he had helped save. No cheering squadron. No dramatic farewell. Just a quiet evacuation into the dark, humid night. The Japanese believed the threat was finally gone. The ghost had been exorcised. But the damage was done. Foss's tactics deflection shooting energy, fighting the THAC weave, spread through the Marine Corps like wildfire. Pilots who once feared Zeros now understood them. They fought smarter, lived longer, struck harder. The tide was turning, not because America suddenly built a better plane, but because one pilot taught an entire theater of war how to see the sky differently. Foss had broken more than a record. He had broken the myth of Japanese invincibility. And myths, once broken, never heal the same way again. The cost was enormous, but the impact was immeasurable. When Joe Foss finally opened his eyes in a stateside hospital, the war felt impossibly far away, like a nightmare that had chewed through his body and then spit him back onto clean sheets and quiet hallways. The doctors in San Diego fought the malaria inch by inch, pulling him out of the fevered darkness he had flown through for too long. Slowly, painfully, his strength returned. His weight crept back. The shaking stopped. And beneath the exhaustion, the man who had turned the Pacific upside down began to re-emerge. On May 18, 1943, that recovery ended in a place no kid from a dirt farm could have imagined: the White House. Joe Foss stood before President Franklin D. Roosevelt, still carrying the thinness of illness in his cheeks, still walking with the fatigue of battle in his bones. And yet, when FDR placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, Foss didn't look like a sick man. He looked like what he was: the embodiment of an idea the country desperately needed, that ordinary Americans, men with rough hands and quiet voices, could rise high enough to change the shape of a war. But medals were not his destiny. The sky had marked him, but it did not define him. When the war ended, Foss didn't stay in uniform. He went home to the wide fields and harsh winds that had built him. He used his fame not to bask in glory, but to serve. He entered politics, winning a seat in the South Dakota legislature, then rising all the way to governor. Years later, he became the first commissioner of the American Football League, shaping a sports legacy as enduring as his war record. Yet, through every chapter, from fighter ace to politician to national figure, he remained at his core the same man who learned to lead moving targets by watching jackrabbits scatter across frozen ground. He never boasted, never mythologized himself, never pretended his victories were magic. He credited his farm, his father, his upbringing, his grit. And that's the point of his story. Wars aren't won by perfect machines or elegant strategies drafted in quiet rooms. They're won by individuals who recognize flaws and dare to fix them. A mechanic named James McKenna tightening a cable with a scrap of piano wire. A Finnish farmer named Simo Heiha discarding a scope to avoid the glint that gives away a position. A South Dakota hunter named Joe Foss firing at empty air because he knew the enemy would arrive inside the future he predicted. These were not the men the manuals were written for. These were the men who rewrote the manuals. Joe Foss died in 2003 at age 87, buried with full military honors. Not because he was perfect, not because he was fearless, but because he refused to let the world tell him who he was allowed to be. And today, his story matters because it reminds us history is not built by the expected. It's built by the stubborn, the overlooked, the ones who see differently. If this story moved you, stay with us. Like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because remembering these quiet giants, that's how we keep their courage alive. When I look at Joe Foss's story, I'm reminded that history isn't just written by nations or generals. It's written by ordinary people who refuse to accept their limits. A farm kid with no electricity, no privilege, and every reason to quit, somehow reshaped the fate of a war simply because he believed he could do better. And I think that matters today more than ever. It's proof that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a quiet decision to stand up one more time, even when everything in you is breaking. If you'd like to keep exploring these human moments inside the chaos of World War II, I'd love for you to stay with us. Feel free to subscribe, like the video, and share where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive and it means more than you know.